I'm Sergeant Luna Bartlett, 29 years old. I came back from Afghanistan without telling anyone. I just showed up one evening, and the moment I stepped inside, nothing felt familiar. No one seemed surprised. No one saved me a seat. Then I heard it, my sister's scream from behind a locked door. I called 911, but what they found inside wasn't just a bad night. If you're watching this video, let me know where you're watching from. And please like and subscribe. This story is about the crimes and the hidden corners behind the dazzling lives of two-faced people. The two Fairfax County police officers who stepped into the grand marble foyer of my mother's home looked exactly as they should. Professional, serious, their hands resting near their belts. My own training kicked in, and I immediately began assessing the scene through their eyes. A distressed woman in uniform, me, a locked door, a potential domestic situation. For a fleeting second, I felt a surge of hope. This was a system I understood. A clear chain of command, a protocol. The truth would come out. But then Alistair Vance moved. He didn't rush or act defensively. He glided from the living room, a concerned patriarch, his expensive suit unruffled. He extended a hand to the older officer. "Thank you, officers, for coming so quickly," he said, his voice the same calm, reassuring baritone that Virginia voters heard on television. He controlled the narrative before I could even speak. He looked at me, not with anger, but with a deep, practiced sorrow. "My eldest daughter, Luna," he explained, his hand gesturing towards me as if presenting a fragile exhibit. "She just returned from a difficult deployment. I'm afraid she's grappling with some ghosts." The word hung in the air, a perfectly deployed smoke grenade of doubt. In one sentence, he had reframed the entire situation. I wasn't a witness, I was a victim of trauma. The scream wasn't a crime, it was a trigger. Ice formed in my veins. He had already neutralized me. The younger officer glanced at me, his professional gaze now tinged with clinical pity. The older one, a man with graying temples who looked like he'd seen it all, gave Alistair a respectful nod. "We understand, Senator. Can you tell us what happened?" "I think Luna was just startled," Alistair said smoothly, turning his attention to the heavy mahogany door of the library. "Sarah, our youngest, was having a bit of a panic attack. Luna may have misinterpreted it." He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the door, not like a man revealing a crime scene, but like a host, opening a room for his guests. The scene inside was a masterpiece of deception. My sister, Sarah, was curled up on a dark green Chesterfield sofa, the kind you see in old photos of powerful men. Her expensive gala dress was artfully rumpled, her face buried in a velvet cushion. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, just a beautiful, distraught 19-year-old girl. A theatrical display of panic. My mother, Eleonora, executed her role with perfect timing. She rushed past me, a flurry of silk and contrived maternal panic, and knelt beside the sofa. She wrapped her arms around Sarah, cooing softly. But as she did, she shot a look over her shoulder at me. It wasn't a look of relief or confusion. It was pure, undiluted reprimand. "You scared her, Luna," she whispered, her voice a sharp accusation. The words struck me harder than any physical blow. Not, "What happened?" Not, "Are you okay, honey?" Just blame. My presence, my concern had been twisted into an act of aggression. I watched my mother build a wall around my sister, a human shield made of lies. The two officers stood in the doorway, their posture relaxing. The tension in the room had evaporated, replaced by a sense of awkwardness, as if they had intruded on a private family drama. I tried to regain control. My voice was hoarse. I heard a scream. A real scream. Not a panic attack. I looked at the older officer, trying to connect with him, soldier to public servant. She was shouting, "No." The officer's expression was one of patient, patronizing gentleness. He took a step towards me, deliberately creating distance between us and the others. "Sergeant," he said, keeping his voice low, a counterfeit gesture of respect. "We appreciate your service, truly. But the stress of combat, it's a real thing." It can make things feel amplified. He let the word hang there. Amplified. Not real. He wasn't looking at me like a credible witness anymore. He was looking at me like a patient, a case file. He was suggesting I talk to someone at the VA. He spoke about post-traumatic stress as if he'd read a pamphlet on it. My uniform, my rank, my entire career had just been used to disqualify me, to paint me as unstable. The very foundation of my identity was being systematically dismantled right in front of me. I felt my throat tighten, the rage and frustration choking me. The world was tilting, and I was losing my footing. They had taken my truth and turned it into a symptom. They closed their notebooks. They offered their condolences for my difficult transition back to civilian life and assured the senator they were always available if the family needed anything. And just like that, it was over. The law had arrived, tipped its hat to power, and walked away. As the front door clicked shut, leaving a profound silence in its wake, Alistair approached me. The concerned father persona dissolved, replaced by something cold and hard. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, the gesture looking deceptively paternal from a distance. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey. "Welcome home, soldier," he whispered, his voice a blade of ice against my ear. "In this house, you have no rank. Know your place." The pat he gave my shoulder wasn't comforting. It was a brand, a final, definitive stamp of his absolute authority. He had won the first battle without breaking a sweat, without even raising his voice. He turned and walked back towards the library, a king reclaiming his castle. I stood alone in the marble foyer, the polished floor reflecting a distorted version of myself. My sister was a prisoner, my mother was a willing accomplice, and I was the crazy one. I looked across the vast room at my mother, who was now helping a silent Sarah to her feet. For a moment, she glanced up and our eyes met. There was no apology in them, no plea for understanding, just a cold, empty distance. And in that hollow space, a single, devastating question began to form, a question that would become the new mission of my life. How could my own mother, the woman who gave birth to me, look at me with eyes like that? That night, sleep was a foreign country I couldn't enter. So instead, I walked. I wandered the silent, cavernous halls of the house I grew up in, feeling more like an intruder than a daughter. The place wasn't a home. It was a museum dedicated to a family I barely recognized. The walls were a curated gallery of perfection. Here was Sarah, grinning on a sailboat with Alistair. There was Sarah, accepting an academic award from my mother. And here they were, the perfect trio, laughing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a picture-perfect political family. Their smiles were bright, their poses effortless. Every silver frame held a lie. My footsteps were muffled by the plush oriental rugs as I searched for any evidence of my own existence. I finally found it in the hallway leading to the guest rooms. Tucked behind a tall, ornate lamp, almost completely obscured by shadow, was a small 5x7 photo of me. It was my high school graduation picture, years old. I looked serious, my jaw set, a younger version of the soldier I would become. I hadn't been placed on the main gallery wall in the living room. I had been filed away, an inconvenient footnote in their carefully crafted story. This house didn't hold my memories. It was actively erasing them. My fingers brushed against the cool glass of the frame, and a specific memory, sharp and cold, surfaced from the depths. It was a frigid Friday night in my junior year. The entire town lived for those Friday night lights, and this game was no different. Under the glare of the stadium floodlights, my world was divided into two stages. On the field, Sarah, the varsity cheer captain, was the star. She was radiant, all high kicks and dazzling smiles. Her every move met with roars from the crowd. My mother and Alistair were in the front row bleachers, their faces glowing with pride, shouting her name. My stage was the bandstand. I played the trumpet in the marching band. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. It required discipline and hundreds of hours of practice, marching in formation until my legs ached. That night, our halftime show was a complex piece we'd been rehearsing for months. I had a small solo, just 8 bars of music. but I'd poured my heart into it. As the second quarter ended, I watched from across the field as the cheerleaders finished their routine. Then, I saw my mother and Alistair stand up. They waved enthusiastically to Sarah, blew her a kiss, and then they turned and walked towards the exit. They didn't even stay for halftime. They didn't stay for my 8 bars. I remember standing there in my heavy uniform, the cold metal of the trumpet pressed against my lips, watching them disappear into the parking lot. I played my solo to an empty space in the bleachers where my family was supposed to be. The notes were perfect, clear and sharp in the cold night air, but they felt hollow, played for ghosts. The ache of that memory was an old, familiar friend. It was the same feeling I got the Christmas I turned 18, just before I left for basic training. I'd scraped together every dollar from my part-time job at a local diner to buy Alistair a gift I thought he'd genuinely love. He was always talking about American history, about the great generals, so I bought him a beautiful, leather-bound collector's edition set of books on the Civil War. It cost me nearly $200. On Christmas morning, surrounded by glittering wrapping paper and the scent of pine, he opened it. He looked at the heavy books, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before his public smile clicked into place. "Thank you, Luna," he said with a dismissive chuckle. "But my focus is on the campaign right now. No time for old wars." His words were light, but they carried the weight of rejection. A few weeks later, I was dropping off some old clothes at a Goodwill donation bin behind the strip mall. And there it was. My gift. The entire leather-bound collection sitting on top of a pile of discarded junk. He hadn't even bothered to hide it. My effort, my carefully chosen gift, had been thrown out with the trash. That was the moment I stopped trying to earn a place in his world. I decided to build my own. Tonight, the memory still stung. I quietly made my way to the one room Alistair rarely entered, the small downstairs office that had belonged to my real father, Sergeant Michael Bartlett, USMC. Alistair now used it as a makeshift wine cellar, but some of my dad's things were still stored in the back of the closet. I found what I was looking for in a dusty footlocker, a small velvet-lined box. Inside, resting on faded silk, was his purple heart. He earned it in Fallujah and died from his injuries 2 years later, when I was 10. My memories of him were faded but potent. I remembered the scent of gun oil and Old Spice. I remembered the rough texture of his hands. And I remembered his voice, the one true and steady voice of my childhood. I picked up the metal, its cold, heavy weight feeling solid and real in my hand. I remembered him sitting with me on the back porch one afternoon, cleaning his rifle. I had been scared of a thunderstorm, and he had pulled me close. "Courage isn't about not being afraid, kiddo," he told me, his voice a low rumble. "Courage is being scared to death and doing the right thing anyway." Clutching that metal in the dark, his words echoed across the years, a direct order from the past. Alistair and my mother had tried to erase me, to file me away in the shadows. But my father had seen me. He had given me my mission statement long ago. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I couldn't walk away. I couldn't let them win. This was no longer about fighting for their approval or their recognition. That war was long over, and I had lost. This was a new war. I was fighting for my sister. I was fighting for the truth. I was fighting for justice. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The emotional storm of the previous night had passed, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. I was no longer a grieving daughter or a betrayed sister. I was an intelligence analyst, and I had a new mission. Mission objective: conduct reconnaissance and gather intelligence on hostile target, Senator Alistair Vance. I sat at the small desk in my old bedroom, the morning light still gray and thin. My rugged military-grade laptop became my command center. There were no tears, no lingering self-pity. Emotion was a liability I couldn't afford. Instead, I opened a secure document and began to build a profile. I charted everything I had observed: Alistair's smooth deflection with the police, the flicker of fear in my mother's eyes when she looked at him, the precise way Sarah flinched when he entered a room. I began treating the house itself as enemy territory. I mapped out the routines of its occupants, Alistair's morning coffee with the Wall Street Journal at 7 a.m. sharp. My mother's gardening from 10 to 11. Sarah's retreat to her art studio in the afternoon. I noted the blind spots in the security cameras, the creak of the third step on the main staircase. This wasn't my home anymore. It was an operating theater, and I needed to understand every single variable to find a weakness. My first objective was to establish contact with the hostage. I found my opportunity that afternoon. Sarah was in her art studio, a bright, sun-drenched room that was the only place in the house that felt alive. The air smelled of turpentine and oil paints. She was standing before a large canvas, her back to me, her shoulders tense. I kept my voice soft, using the same tone I would to approach a spooked animal. "Sarah," I started. "About last night?" Before I could finish the sentence, a shadow fell across the doorway. My mother glided in, carrying a silver tray with 2 glasses of iced tea and a plate of lemon cookies. Her smile was brittle, painted on. "I thought you two might like a snack," she said, her voice a cheerful melody that didn't reach her eyes. She set the tray down on a small table. But she didn't leave. She pulled up a stool, folded her hands in her lap, and watched us. Her presence was a silent, suffocating force field. "It's so lovely to see you girls catching up." I looked at Sarah, whose eyes were fixed on her canvas. She wouldn't look at me. My mother's smile never wavered, but her gaze was a steel barrier between her 2 daughters. I understood then. My mother wasn't just Alistair's defender. She was his warden, the willing jailer of her own child. Any attempt to communicate would be intercepted. I drank my tea in silence, the taste of defeat bitter in my mouth. Plan A had failed. Time for Plan B, re-engage the official channels. I waited until I was sure Alistair and my mother were out for a fundraising dinner, and I called Detective Harding, the older officer from the night before. I used a prepaid burner phone I'd bought that afternoon, just in case. "Detective, this is Sergeant Bartlett," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. I wanted to provide some additional context about the situation last night. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke, the respectful tone was gone, replaced by a weary, condescending authority. "Sergeant Bartlett," he sighed, as if dealing with a persistent child. "I understand your concern, but we responded to the call, we assessed the situation, and there was no evidence of an assault. The senator is a respected public figure and, frankly, a friend to this department." The unspoken message was clear. You are going up against one of us. "With all due respect, sir," I pressed, "his status shouldn't make him immune to investigation. And your status doesn't give you a pass to make baseless accusations," he shot back, his voice hardening. "If you continue to harass the senator's family, you're going to be the one in trouble. Drop it." The line went dead. I sat there, the phone silent in my hand, and I could almost hear Alistair's smug laughter echoing in the background. His influence was a web, and I had just walked into another one of its strands. He was a step ahead of me, effortlessly turning the very system meant to protect us into a weapon against me. Frustration burned in my chest, but I channeled it. When one route is blocked, you find another. That's how you survive. If the front door was barred, I would find a back window. I switched from direct engagement to open source intelligence, or OSINT, the skills they teach you at Fort Huachuca for tracking hostiles through their digital footprints. I spent the next several hours diving into the deep web of Alistair Vance's past. I scoured old articles from local Virginia newspapers, cross-referenced digital university yearbooks, and sifted through dozens of obscure online forums for alumni of the institutions where he'd worked. For hours, I found nothing but a carefully polished history. Academic awards, glowing testimonials, a steady climb up the political ladder. It was a digital fortress, as impenetrable as his public persona. My eyes grew heavy, the screen blurring. The house was quiet, the weight of my isolation pressing down on me. And then, I found it. It was almost nothing. A tiny digital thread in a sea of noise. A post from 2016 on an old, forgotten blog run by an alumnus of Lexington Preparatory School, an elite boarding school where Alistair had taught history over a decade ago. The post was a short, vaguely worded reminiscence about favorite teachers. But one sentence jumped out at me. It read, "Everyone loved Mr. Vance, which is why it was so weird when he resigned so suddenly in 2015 after that unexplained incident with the student." My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't proof. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was just a whisper. But in a war of silence, a whisper can be as loud as a bomb. It was a crack in the fortress wall. It was a place to start digging. The blog post was my only lead, a single thread hanging in the dark. I spent an hour tracing the digital breadcrumbs from the defunct blog to a LinkedIn profile. Orion Hayes. The former high school blogger was now an architect in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond was a 2-hour drive south. Calling him was out of the question. For all I knew, Alistair had the resources to monitor my calls. A direct confrontation at his office was too aggressive. So I planned the operation with the care of a field mission. I drove my beat-up Ford pickup down I-95, the highway stretching out like a gray ribbon, giving me time to rehearse what I would say. His office was in a sleek, modern building of glass and steel. I didn't go in. Instead, I found a small, independent coffee shop across the street called The Daily Grind. It was warm inside, smelling of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. I took a small table by the window with a clear line of sight to his building's entrance. From my burner phone, I composed a short, precise email. Subject: Lexington Prep, 2015. The body was just 3 sentences. My name is Luna Bartlett. I'm a soldier. I need to talk to you about Mr. Vance. I'm at the Daily Grind across the street. I hit send. Then I waited, nursing a black coffee, my heart pounding a steady, nervous rhythm against my ribs. I was placing my entire mission in the hands of a stranger's conscience. For 30 long minutes, nothing happened. I started to think it was another dead end. I was about to leave when the door to the coffee shop chimed. A man in his late 20s, dressed in a sharp blazer and dark jeans, stepped inside. He scanned the room, his eyes wide with an anxiety I recognized instantly. It was the look of someone stepping into a minefield. Our eyes met. It was Orion. He approached my table cautiously and sat down in the chair opposite me, keeping his briefcase on his lap like a shield. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and defensive. "Why are you looking for me?" I met his gaze directly. There was no room for deception here, only the raw truth would work. "My stepfather is Alistair Vance," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I believe he's hurting my younger sister, and I believe the key to stopping him is understanding what happened at Lexington in 2015. I saw a wall go up in his eyes. Fear. It was the same fear I saw in my mother, the fear of a powerful man's wrath. He shook his head slightly, ready to deny everything. "I don't know what you're talking about. That was a long time ago. I was just a kid." He was about to get up and leave. I had one last shot. "He's telling everyone I'm crazy," I said, the words coming out with more raw emotion than I intended. "He's a United States Senator. The police, my own mother, they all believe him. They think I'm just some broken soldier with PTSD who's making things up. I know I'm not crazy. But I'm all alone in this, and I don't know what else to do." Something in my plea, in the sheer desperation of my isolation, broke through his fear. He settled back into his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. He looked at me for a long moment, really looked at me. Then he let out a slow breath. "He always had favorites," Orion began, his voice barely a whisper. "Favorite female students. It wasn't anything you could ever prove. It was private tutoring sessions that ran late, small, expensive gifts, a hand on a shoulder that lingered a little too long." He looked down at the table, ashamed. "We all saw it, the other students, even some of the teachers. But we never said anything. He was Mr. Vance. He was charming, beloved. The kind of teacher who wrote your college recommendation letters and remembered your birthday. To speak out against him would have been impossible." I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy. The words echoed in my head. We all saw it. It was the first external validation I'd had. The first sign that the reality I was seeing wasn't just a phantom of my own mind. I wasn't crazy. Orion went up to the counter and came back with another coffee, placing it in front of me. A simple, kind gesture. It was a kindness I hadn't received from my own mother, and the stark contrast made my throat ache. "I don't have any hard evidence," he said, finally meeting my eyes again. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with regret. He was too smart for that. "But I can give you something else." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "There was a girl. Her name was Chloe. Chloe Jensen. She was my best friend. She was one of his favorites. After the incident, her family moved away, suddenly. Pulled her out of school in the middle of the semester. They moved to North Carolina, I think. We all just stopped hearing from her. Her parents told everyone it was for a job opportunity, but we knew it wasn't true." He slid a napkin across the table. He had written a name on it. Chloe Jensen. "I was a coward," he said, his voice thick with a decade of guilt. "I never reached out. I never asked if she was okay. I was too scared of what it would do to my own future." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for an understanding I couldn't yet give. "Find Chloe," he said. Maybe she'll talk to you." He stood up, leaving the napkin on the table. "Good luck, Sergeant," he said, then turned and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. I sat there for a long time, the warmth of the coffee cup seeping into my cold hands. Orion hadn't given me a weapon. He'd given me a map. He'd given me a name. But more than that, he'd given me hope. For the first time since I'd stepped off that plane, I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The drive back from Richmond felt different. For the first time, I wasn't just running on anger and instinct. I had a flicker of hope. A name. Chloe Jensen. It was a tangible lead, a real direction. But that hope was a fragile flame, and I should have known Alistair Vance specialized in extinguishing flames. I had barely walked through the door when my phone rang. It was an unsaved number, but the area code was Fort Bragg. My stomach tightened. It was my commanding officer, Captain Miller. His voice, usually warm and familiar, was now stiff and formal. "Sergeant Bartlett," he began, without any of the usual pleasantries. "I just had a courtesy call with Senator Vance." He put a strange emphasis on the words, and I could hear the quotation marks hanging in the air. "He expressed his profound concern for your well-being, Luna. He suggested, quite strongly, that you undergo a mandatory psychological evaluation before returning to active duty." I went completely still, the phone cold against my ear. The silence stretched. Alistair hadn't just been watching me. He had reached across states, across jurisdictions, and into the very heart of the institution I had dedicated my life to. The U.S. Army was my sanctuary, the one place where my performance spoke for itself, where I was judged on merit, not by the whims of a powerful stepfather, and now he had contaminated it. He had turned my own career, my honor, into a weapon to be used against me, painting me as another damaged soldier, unreliable and unstable. The hope I'd felt just an hour earlier vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. That evening, Alistair announced we were having a family dinner. The request was delivered with a benevolent smile, but it felt like a summons. The air in the formal dining room was thick and heavy, like the moments before a storm. The clinking of silverware against my mother's fine china was the only sound. Alistair carefully set down his knife and fork, placing them perfectly parallel on his plate of filet mignon. He folded his hands, the picture of paternal concern. "Luna, honey," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Your mother and I are truly worried about you. We think that what you went through over there, in Afghanistan, it might have been more than anyone could bear. There are excellent professionals, people who can help you process everything." My mother, seated to my left, immediately chimed in, nodding her head so vigorously her pearl earrings trembled. "That's right, dear. Alistair just wants what's best for you. We all do." I looked from his compassionate mask to her anxious face. This wasn't concern. This was a coordinated psychological operation. In the Army, we called it CSYOP. First, you isolate the target. Then, you discredit them. You plant seeds of doubt until they can no longer trust their own perception of reality. They weren't trying to help me. They were building their case, constructing a narrative for the world in which I was the unhinged veteran, and he was the long-suffering father. I was being gaslit over a plate of perfectly cooked steak and roasted asparagus. My eyes darted to Sarah, my last hope for an ally at this table. I tried to catch her gaze, to send a silent signal of support, of solidarity. But she just stared down at her plate, pushing a piece of potato around with her fork. She was a ghost at her own dinner table. Alistair noticed my glance. He reached over and placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gesture that looked affectionate but felt possessive. "Our Sarah is a very sensitive girl," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "Try not to frighten her anymore, Luna." The message was brutally clear. It was a display of control over her and a direct warning to me. I have her. You can't touch her. My sister wasn't just a victim in this house, she was a hostage, and her well-being was now the leverage he was using against me. The rest of the dinner was a blur of polite, meaningless chatter. After, while my mother and Sarah cleared the plates, Alistair gestured for me to join him in the living room. He stood by the grand fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand. The charming politician was gone. In his place was a predator. "I know you went to Richmond," he said, his voice a low hiss, devoid of all warmth. "I know you met with Orion Hayes." The confirmation sent a chill down my spine. He had me followed. The paranoia I'd felt was not paranoia at all. It was an accurate assessment of the threat. "What do you think you're doing?" he sneered, taking a step closer. "Playing spy? This is my world, Luna, not yours. These are my rules." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "You need to stop this, now, before you destroy not only yourself, but that poor, troubled girl you're looking for." "Chloe." He said her name. He knew. He wasn't just admitting his own guilt. He was threatening a past victim to ensure the silence of a future one. The unspoken promise in his words was terrifying. "If you bring her into this, I will ruin her all over again." The battle was no longer a secret war I was fighting in the shadows. He had just declared it, openly and with absolute confidence. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he had already won. If you have ever been made to feel like the crazy one by someone who was supposed to protect you, please support my story by hitting the like button. And let me know in the comments below by simply writing, "I see you." Because in that moment, I felt completely invisible and I just needed one person to see the truth. He watched me, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on his lips, waiting for me to break. But he didn't know the first rule of fighting a soldier. You never, ever corner them. Because when there is no room for retreat, there is only one way forward. Alistair's counterattack was swift, public, and brutally ironic. The following day, he scheduled a press conference in our own living room. The topic? A new bill he was co-sponsoring to improve mental health support for veterans. The hypocrisy was so staggering, it was almost brilliant. And then came the final insult. He requested, no, he demanded, that I be there, standing beside him, in my full Army service uniform. My mother delivered the summons to my room. She wouldn't look at me. "He thinks it would present a strong, unified family front," she recited, as if reading from a script. She straightened the lapel on my jacket, her hands trembling slightly. "Just smile, Luna, please. Just for this one thing." I looked at my own reflection in the mirror. The uniform, a source of immense pride and identity, now felt like a costume. He wanted to use me, my service, my sacrifice, as a prop in his disgusting theater. He was going to stand in front of cameras, talking about the importance of supporting soldiers, while actively working to destroy the career of the one standing next to him. This was the last straw, the final unbearable weight that breaks the beam. My silence had become a form of complicity, and I was done being complicit. The living room was crowded with local news crews. Cameras, lights, microphones on booms. Alistair's aides scurried around, handing out press kits. The American flag and the Virginia state flag were positioned perfectly behind the podium. It was all a carefully staged performance. I was positioned just to his right, slightly behind him. Close enough to be in the shot, but not so close as to be his equal. My mother stood nearby, her face a tight mask of anxiety. Alistair stepped up to the podium, his face radiating sincerity and gravitas. He began his speech, his voice resonating with practiced passion. Our nation owes an immeasurable debt to the brave men and women who wear the uniform, he declared. We must honor their sacrifice, not just with words, but with action. His words became a dull drone in my ears. My focus was elsewhere. Across the room, half hidden in the shadows of the hallway archway, I saw her. Sierra. She was watching, her face pale, her eyes wide and haunted. Our gazes locked across the crowded room. And in that split second, I saw past her fear. I saw a silent plea, a desperate, unspoken prayer for a savior. A line my father used to read to me from his worn Bible echoed in my mind. For there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, and nothing secret that will not be known. I knew what I had to do. The risk was enormous, but the cost of silence was higher. I could not let this lie continue. I could not let his polished words bury the ugly truth forever. While he was mid-sentence talking about the invisible wounds of war, I took one deliberate step forward, moving into the full glare of the camera lights. Alistair faltered. He stopped talking, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. The cameras swiveled towards me. A hush fell over the room. The only sound was the frantic clicking of press cameras. I said nothing. Words were not the right weapon for this moment. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my hands to my chest. My fingers found the two small pins on the back of the rectangular, blue and silver badge above my service ribbons. My Combat Infantryman badge, the CIB. It's not a medal you get for just being there. You earn it in direct ground combat. You earn it with sweat and fear and sometimes blood. It is the most sacred symbol of an infantry soldier's service. My service. I unpinned it from my uniform. The two sharp points pricked my fingertips. Then I placed it on the podium, right in front of him. It landed with a soft, definitive click on the polished wood. The silence in the room was now absolute. It was deafening. That one small action was a declaration of war. It was louder than any scream. It said, "You are not worthy of standing next to this symbol. You are a fraud. You are a liar." Alistair stared at the badge, his face a canvas of disbelief, his perfect composure shattering into a million pieces. Before his aides could rush the stage, before anyone could stop me, I leaned into the microphones. I looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera, the one with the red light, broadcasting live. My voice was not loud, but it was clear, steady, and sharp as a bayonet. "I am Sergeant Luna Bartlett," I said. "I believe that true sacrifice is not something to be put on display at a press conference." I paused, letting the words sink in. "And I believe that the most dangerous monsters aren't always on the battlefield. Sometimes they are living right inside our own homes." Then I turned my back on him. I didn't run. I walked. I walked straight through the stunned crowd, past the flashing cameras and the shocked faces of the reporters. I walked out of the living room, out of the front door, and into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a stunned senator, a media firestorm about to erupt, and the wreckage of a perfectly constructed lie. The war was no longer silent. It had just begun. My calculated act of defiance at the press conference bought me one thing: chaos. And in chaos, there is opportunity. While Alistair and his team scrambled to do damage control, spinning stories to the media about my fragile mental state, I disappeared. I checked into a cheap Motel 6 off the highway, paying in cash. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach, a world away from the suffocating potpourri of my mother's house. It was the safest I'd felt in days. My phone buzzed with dozens of missed calls from my mother, but that night, a call came through from a blocked number. I hesitated, then answered. "Don't say anything," a familiar, gravelly voice said. "It's Detective Harding. What you did today, that took guts, Sergeant, real guts." There was a pause. "I was wrong to dismiss you. The senator's influence, it can make a man blind. If you're serious about this fight, I'll help." but it has to be off the books, completely. For the first time since this nightmare began, a hand reached out to me from inside the system. It wasn't just a lifeline, it was validation. Following his precise instructions, I drove late that night to a small Baptist church in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Its parking lot was empty and dark, lit only by a single, flickering streetlight. An unmarked sedan was parked in the far corner. I pulled up beside it. Detective Harding rolled down his window. He looked older, more tired than he had in my mother's foyer. "Vance has eyes and ears everywhere," he said, his voice low. "We have to be careful." He didn't waste time. "Your stunt today made me do some digging. The kind of digging my captain would suspend me for." He slid a manila folder across the seat to me. I pulled Vance's jacket. Deep. Found something buried in an old interagency file from Lexington PD, a report from 2015. A female student made an accusation. It was dismissed as unfounded, of course. The girl's family moved a week later. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the folder, and there it was, in black and white. The complainant's name, Chloe Jensen. "I found a current address for her," Harding said, tapping a section of the report. "A small town in North Carolina." "But Luna," he looked me dead in the eye. "You have to be careful. If Vance buried this once, he won't hesitate to destroy her again to keep her quiet." The next morning, I was on the road again, heading south into North Carolina. I found Chloe living in a modest, tidy bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street. She was a registered nurse now. When she answered the door, I saw the same fear in her eyes that I'd seen in Orion's, only this was older, deeper. At first, she refused to speak to me. "He already ruined my life once," she said, tears welling in her eyes as she stood in her own doorway, hugging herself tightly. "My family had to move. I had to change schools. He threatened to have my dad fired from his job if I ever said another word." I didn't push. I didn't demand. I just stood there on her welcome mat and I told her about Sarah. I told her about the scream, about the locked door, about the way my own mother was acting as a prison guard. I let her see the desperation and the fight in my own eyes. I let her know she wasn't alone in the dark. Slowly, the dam of her fear began to crack. She invited me in. She couldn't agree to testify. She was still too terrified, and I understood that. But she wanted to help. She disappeared into her bedroom and came back with an old, outdated smartphone. "I never deleted it," she whispered, her hands shaking as she navigated to a saved audio file. "I was too scared to." She played it for me. It was a voicemail from years ago. Alistair's voice filled the small living room, but it wasn't the smooth, charming voice of a senator. It was a venomous snarl. "You and your family will regret the day you were ever born if you don't learn to keep your mouth shut. Do you understand me, Chloe? I will burn your whole world to the ground." It was the voice of the monster I knew, and now I had proof. Armed with Chloe's voicemail and a renewed sense of purpose, I planned one more high-risk operation. I drove back to Virginia, timing my arrival for midday, when I knew Alistair would be at his office and my mother would be at her weekly luncheon. I let myself into the silent house, my heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. I went straight to Sarah's room. When we were kids, we had a secret hiding place, a loose floorboard under the rug in her closet. We used it to hide candy, comic books, and secret notes from each other. It was a long shot, but I had to check. I pulled back the Persian rug, found the edge of the board, and pried it up. And there, in the dark space beneath, was a simple, spiral-bound notebook. My hands trembled as I opened it. It wasn't a diary filled with words. The pages were covered in dense, frantic lines of symbols, drawings, and characters that would look like nonsense to anyone else. But not to me. It was our code. A private language we had invented as children to write to each other, a secret alphabet of 2. As I scanned the desperate, encrypted entries, I knew. I was holding the key. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a cry for help. It was a map of my sister's tormented soul. My next mission was clear. I had to decrypt the truth. The Senate Ethics Committee convened the preliminary inquiry not in a courtroom, but in a formal hearing chamber on Capitol Hill. This was Alistair's world, a place of power and influence, paneled in dark mahogany and smelling of old leather, where hushed conversations in the hallway could decide the fate of nations. It was designed to intimidate. Alistair made his entrance flanked by a team of 3 lawyers from a top DC firm, all with razor-sharp suits and predatory smiles. He played his part to perfection, the very picture of wronged dignity, a statesman forced to endure a distasteful family squabble. His face was a mask of solemn concern, his bearing unimpeachable. My own contingent felt laughably small in comparison. It was just me, my fierce, young pro bono lawyer, Anya Sharma, who radiated an energy that far exceeded her years, and, sitting in the back row as a private citizen, Detective Harding, his face an unreadable stone. The battle began just as I knew it would. Alistair's lead counsel, a silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne with a voice like gravel, went on the offensive. He didn't just question my story, he vivisected my entire life. He painted a masterful, damning portrait of me as a disturbed and unstable combat veteran, a ticking time bomb of PTSD. He presented my military record not as a history of service, but as a catalog of trauma. He twisted my concern for Sarah into a resentful obsession, a desperate attempt by the forgotten daughter to lash out at the stepfather who had, in his words, rescued her family. For nearly an hour, they chipped away at my credibility. Every question was a trap, every statement a subtle insinuation. They were good, frighteningly good. I could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting. I saw the doubt creeping into the faces of the committee members, a panel of seasoned politicians adept at sensing weakness. I was no longer a whistleblower. I was a problem. Alistair sat at his table, occasionally shaking his head with a look of profound sadness, looking more like the victim than the perpetrator. He was winning. Then, it was our turn. Anya's voice was a sharp, clear contrast to Thorne's booming baritone. She called me to the witness stand. My heart hammered, but my training took over. I focused on my breathing, kept my posture straight, my answers short and precise. Anya led me through the events, but the real weapon was the one I'd smuggled out of Sarah's room. We would like to present selections from a journal kept by Serafina Bartlett, Anya announced, holding up the translated pages of the coded notebook. Thorne immediately objected, calling it hearsay and fantasy, but the chairman, intrigued, overruled him. Anya began to read, her voice echoing in the suddenly silent chamber. The childish code, translated into plain, devastating English, was a gut punch. Entry 42, the dark room again. He calls it our secret game. Luna, why aren't you home yet? It hurts. He said it's my fault when it hurts. I don't want to play anymore. Entry 51, he was angry at Mom today. Now he's being nice to me. The nice is scarier than the angry. He brought me a present. I don't want it. From his table, I heard Alistair let out a soft, contemptuous laugh. It was a calculated sound, meant to signal to everyone how ridiculous this all was. Thorne stood up. Mr. Chairman, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. With all due respect, we are listening to the dramatic, fictional diary of a troubled, attention-seeking adolescent. This is not evidence. My fists clenched under the table. They were trying to erase her, just like they had tried to erase me. But just as the chairman began to nod in agreement, I saw Harding, in the back of the room, give Anya a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Mr. Chairman, Anya said, her voice cutting through the impending dismissal like a razor. We have one final piece of evidence to present, an audio recording recovered from the Bartlett Vance residence. An audio technician, arranged by Harding's off-the-books contacts, set up a small speaker. A file was clicked. A moment of static filled the room, and then a sound. The unmistakable electronic wake word of the Amazon Echo Smart speaker from Alistair's own library. Alexa. Someone, Sarah probably, must have said it by accident. And the device, in its silent digital omniscience, had started recording. First, we heard Sarah's voice, small and trembling, a ghost in the machine. Please, just leave me alone. And then, Alistair's voice. But this was not the polished, senatorial baritone the committee knew. This was a guttural, vicious snarl, the voice of a predator, dripping with menace. You will keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you and your mother. Don't make me say it again. A beat of charged silence. Then, the sound of a choked, desperate sob from my sister. The recording ended. The effect was instantaneous. The mask of the perfect patriarch didn't just crack, it exploded. Alistair's face went white, the color draining from it as if his own blood had turned to ice. His lawyers were frozen, their mouths slightly agape, their entire, carefully constructed narrative incinerated by a 30-second audio clip. The committee members stared, their political poker faces replaced by raw, human shock. The truth, in Alistair's own monstrous voice, was irrefutable. The room was paralyzed in that moment of stunned silence. But the final, fatal blow, the one that would ensure the fortress could never be rebuilt, came from the one person I never, ever expected. My mother, Eleonora. She'd been sitting silently behind Alistair the entire hearing, a perfect porcelain statue of a supportive, grieving wife. But now, with an effort that seemed to take all the strength she possessed, she stood up. Her movements were slow, shaky, as if she were learning to walk again. She didn't look at the committee. She didn't look at me. She looked only at her husband. For the first time in more than a decade, I saw the woman he had tried to bury. The fear was still in her eyes, a deep, abiding terror. But something else was there now, too. A flicker of rebellion. A spark of the woman she used to be. Her voice when she spoke did not tremble. It was clear, and it carried across the silent, breathless room. "He hit me," she said. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. Alistair whipped his head around to look at her, his eyes wide with panicked, sputtering disbelief. "He has been hitting me for 10 years, my mother continued, her gaze locked on his, her voice growing stronger, fueled by a decade of suppressed rage. "That recording is real. Sarah's diary is real." She finally turned her head and looked at me. For the first time since I'd come home, I saw my mother, not the warden, not the accomplice. Just Mom, and her eyes were a galaxy of pain and regret. "It's all true," she said, her voice finally breaking with a sob that tore through the silence of the room. "All of it." It was over. The silence was broken. The dam had burst. The fortress that was Senator Alistair Vance, built on a foundation of lies and fear, had just crumbled to dust. And in the silent, echoing ruin, we were all left standing, forced to finally see the ugly, unvarnished truth. Winning the war and living with the peace are two very different things. The immediate aftermath of the hearing wasn't relief. It was a Category 5 hurricane of media attention. Our quiet, manicured suburban street turned into a 24/7 news encampment. White vans from CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC were parked bumper to bumper. Their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like metallic sunflowers. Paparazzi with long-lens cameras hid in the bushes. Our family's private tragedy was now public consumption, dissected and debated on cable news by pundits who didn't know the first thing about us. We had won. Justice had been served. But the price of that victory was the complete and utter demolition of our privacy. The magnificent house that had once been a gilded cage now felt like a glass one, with the whole world staring in. We had survived the battle, but now we had to navigate the wreckage. A few days after the hearing, I found my mother in the kitchen, sitting alone at the large marble island, staring into a cold cup of coffee. The house was unnaturally quiet. Sarah was upstairs, sleeping for the first time in what seemed like years. My mother looked up as I entered, and her face was a roadmap of exhaustion and shame. For the first time since I'd come home, she spoke to me. Really spoke. "I am so sorry, Luna," she whispered, and the words seemed to physically tear their way out of her. A single tear traced a path down her tired cheek. "I was so afraid. For so long. He took everything from me, piece by piece. My friends, my money, my courage. He took my courage." Listening to her, I didn't feel the old, familiar sting of anger. It had burned itself out, leaving behind only a profound, hollow sadness. I saw her not as my jailer, but as a fellow prisoner of war, one who had been captive for much longer than Sarah. I walked around the island and put my arms around her. It was an awkward embrace, unfamiliar. I held her not as a daughter comforting a mother, but as one soldier would hold another after a firefight, a silent acknowledgement of shared survival. But even in that moment of connection, a part of me, the analyst, the strategist, knew that forgiveness and forgetting are not the same thing. Forgiveness requires boundaries to be real. There was one more ghost I needed to face, one final conversation. A week later, I drove to the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center. I needed to see him. I needed to look him in the eye and hear it from his own mouth. The visiting room was cold and sterile, smelling of antiseptic. We sat on opposite sides of a thick pane of plexiglass, speaking through crackling telephones. He wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that seemed absurdly bright against his pale, furious face. He hadn't lost any of his arrogance, only his power. He picked up the phone. "Are you happy now?" he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You got what you wanted. You shattered everything. You destroyed this family." I listened, my face impassive. I had expected a last-ditch appeal, a feigned apology, maybe even a desperate plea. But there was nothing. No remorse. No accountability. Just pure, unadulterated rage that his world had been taken from him. In that moment, I saw him with perfect, chilling clarity. He was a black hole, a being incapable of change, able only to consume and destroy. He would never understand the damage he had caused because, in his mind, he was the only real person in the universe. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. My silence was the one weapon he couldn't fight. I calmly placed the phone back on its cradle, stood up, and walked out without a backward glance. That was my goodbye. That evening, I sat down at my desk with a pen and a single sheet of plain stationery. An email felt too impersonal for what I needed to say. I wrote a letter to my mother. I told her that I loved her. I told her that I was beginning to understand the fears she had lived with, and that I forgave her for her silence. But I also told her that I could not come back. I couldn't return to the way things were, couldn't step back into the old patterns of a house built on secrets and pain. I needed room to breathe, to heal. I needed to build a life for myself where I wasn't constantly on guard, where my home was a sanctuary, not a battlefield. A quote from Brené Brown, an author whose work on courage and vulnerability had been a lifeline for me during my darkest nights in Afghanistan, came to mind. Clear is kind. Unclear is unkind. It was time to be kind to my mother and to myself by being clear. In the final paragraph, I made my proposal. I asked her and Sarah to leave with me, to sell the house, that grand monument to a lie, and to move somewhere far away from the whispers and the pointing fingers of Washington, D.C. A place where we could be anonymous, a place where we could start over. It wasn't an ultimatum, it was an invitation. It wasn't about running away from the past. It was a strategic redeployment, a tactical move toward a new, defensible position, a place we could finally call home. 6 months later, home was a small log cabin nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. We had sold the Fairfax mansion, that grand hollow mausoleum, and used the money to disappear into the quiet embrace of the Appalachians. There were no more political fundraisers, no more brittle smiles, no more suffocating silences. The only sounds here were the whisper of the wind through the tall pine trees and the morning chatter of blue jays. The only smell was the rich aroma of fresh coffee and damp earth. Healing wasn't a destination. We were learning it was a process, slow and quiet. My mother found her solace in the soil. She started a small garden, and I would watch her from the porch, her hands covered in dirt, carefully tending to rows of tomatoes and basil. It was as if she were coaxing life not just from the ground, but back into herself. Sarah found her voice again through her art. She set up a studio in the sunniest room of the cabin. Her canvases, once filled with dark, abstract shapes of fear, now exploded with vibrant color. She painted landscapes of the mountains, portraits of my mother smiling in the garden, self-portraits where her eyes were finally clear and bright. The silence in our new home wasn't the silence of fear. It was peace. One crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, on thick, cream-colored paper. The return address was an architect's firm in Richmond. It was from Orion Hayes. My hands were steady as I opened it. He wrote that after the Senate hearing, after Alistair's public disgrace and subsequent resignation, something remarkable had happened. Chloe Jensen, emboldened by the truth finally coming to light, had found the courage to come forward officially. And she wasn't alone. 2 other women, former students from Lexington Prep, had joined her. Together, they had filed a civil lawsuit against Alistair. Orion's last lines are words I will carry with me forever. "You didn't just save your sister, Luna," he wrote. "You gave the rest of us a voice. Thank you." I folded the letter, a profound sense of gratitude washing over me. I realized then that my mission hadn't ended in that hearing room. It had started a ripple, a small wave of courage that was now traveling far beyond what I could see. My legacy wouldn't be the battles I fought, but the ones I inspired others to fight for themselves. That was the truest kind of victory. My extended leave from the army was coming to an end, and with it, a choice. My entire adult life had been defined by my service. The structure, the discipline, the mission. It was the only home I had ever truly known. A part of me longed to return to it, to the simple clarity of the uniform. But then I looked out the window. I saw my mother and Sarah laughing together, trimming roses in the garden. They looked up and saw me watching, and Sarah waved, her smile effortless and real. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my unit was right here. My most important deployment was on this small patch of land in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I made a call to Captain Miller. I explained the situation, and to his credit, he understood. He helped me process the paperwork for a transfer from active duty to the Virginia National Guard. I would still serve. I would still be a soldier on the weekends and 1 summer a month. But my new front line would be here, defending the peace we had fought so hard to win. The final scene of this story isn't dramatic. There are no explosions, no confrontations. It's just me, a few weeks later, sitting at our simple wooden kitchen table, filling out my new enlistment forms for the Guard. The morning sun streams through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I move through the boxes methodically. Name, Luna Bartlett. Rank, Sergeant. Unit, pending. Then I get to the line for emergency contact. Without hesitation, I write down a name, Serafina Bartlett. Next to it is the box for relationship. The pre-printed word is there, sister. I look at it for a long moment. It's true, of course, but it's no longer the whole truth. It doesn't capture what we are now. It doesn't describe the bond forged in the fire of a shared battle, the trust rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. I take my pen, and with a single, firm stroke, I cross out the word sister. In the space above it, I write one single, better word. Battle buddy. We were no longer a broken family. We were survivors. A small 3-woman fire team that had been through hell and back, rebuilding our world on our own terms. And this time, we were our own command. So, that was my story. My war fought not on a foreign battlefield, but in the quiet rooms and silent hallways where I was supposed to be safest. Thank you for listening. For bearing witness to it. If you're out there, fighting your own silent battle against someone who's trying to dim your light, please know this. You are not invisible, and you are not crazy. Your voice has power. If you believe that stories like this need to be told, and that one person's courage can create a ripple of change, I hope you'll join our community here. Please like this story so it can find others who need to hear it, and subscribe to be a part of our ongoing mission. Until next time, stay strong.